Mark Kilroy. In March 1989, Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old University of Texas student, was on spring break at South Padre Island when he and 3 friends crossed into Matamoros, Mexico, for a night out. A pre-med student with a bright future ahead of him, he had crossed the border for nothing more than an evening of music and drinks. While moving between the bars along the city's nightlife strip, Kilroy became separated from his friends and was lured toward a truck by a man he did not know. It was the last anyone in his group saw of him. By the time they realized he was gone, he had already been driven out of the city. He was never seen alive again. Kilroy had been abducted by members of a narco-satanic cult led by Adolfo Constanzo, a charismatic figure his followers called the Godfather, and his lieutenant Sara Aldrete, whom they called the Godmother. The group blended drug trafficking with a twisted ritual practice, and they believed that human sacrifice gave them supernatural protection from the police and from rival gangs. Kilroy was driven to a remote ranch outside the city, held there for hours, and then killed in one of the cult's rituals. The group practiced a dark, improvised form of folk religion, and they had come to believe that ritual killing bought them favor and protection for their drug running. His was not the first such death at that ranch. Why had a random American tourist been chosen, and how many others had vanished the same way? Investigators came to believe Kilroy had simply been in the wrong place, seized almost at random to serve as a sacrifice. The horror came to light almost by accident in April 1989, when a cult member drove straight through a police drug checkpoint and a search led investigators back to the ranch. One of Constanzo's men, believing himself untouchable, simply ignored the checkpoint, and that arrogance unraveled everything. There they unearthed the remains of 15 people, all of them men, killed over roughly 9 months. What investigators found at the ranch was so disturbing that seasoned officers struggled to describe it, and the details are best left undescribed here. 3 of the 15 were never even identified, their families likely never learning what had become of them. Kilroy's family had been searching desperately for him, and the grim discovery turned a missing person case into one of the most shocking crime stories of the decade. Constanzo fled to Mexico City. When police surrounded his hideout there weeks later, he chose not to be taken alive. Cornered and unwilling to surrender, Constanzo decided he would die rather than be captured. He ordered one of his own followers to shoot him and his companion, and both men died at the scene. It was a bizarre, violent end for a man who had convinced others he was untouchable. Aldrete and several other members were arrested. Who were they? Constanzo had built a following by mixing real criminal muscle with claims of mystical power, convincing hardened traffickers that his rituals kept their business safe. He had moved from Mexico City into the border underworld, offering a kind of protection no rival could match. Aldrete, a college student who had been drawn into his orbit, became his trusted second. To those around them, the pair seemed to wield a strange authority, part criminal and part priestly, over a group that did whatever they asked. Together, they presided over a campaign of killing dressed up as religion, one that ran for months before anyone connected the disappearances. Constanzo died in 1989 and never faced trial. Sara Aldrete was convicted and sentenced to decades in a Mexican prison, where she remains more than 30 years later, maintaining her innocence and seeking early release. Other members of the cult were also convicted and given long sentences for the killings at the ranch. United States authorities have said that if she is ever freed, they intend to prosecute her for Kilroy's murder. The young man who crossed the border for a single night out became the victim, whose disappearance finally brought the whole operation crashing down. His parents went on to campaign for greater awareness of the dangers facing young travelers, determined that something good come from their loss. The next case followed a very different predator, one who turned the backpacking trails of Asia into his hunting ground. Charles Sobrage. To the backpackers he met on the road, he was a charming gem dealer offering friendship. He was in fact a serial killer who robbed and murdered his way across Asia. In the mid-1970s, Charles Sobhraj preyed on young Western tourists traveling the so-called hippie trail through Thailand, Nepal, and India. Posing as a gem dealer or a helpful fixer, he won the trust of travelers, then drugged, robbed, and murdered them. He would befriend a tourist, offer help or hospitality, and slip them drugs, taking their money, their passports, and often their lives. He became known as the Bikini Killer after one victim was found on a beach, and as the Serpent for his slipperiness and his gift for escape. Charming, multilingual, and utterly without conscience, he moved easily among the young travelers he intended to kill. He is suspected of killing more than 20 people. Most were in their 20s, traveling on tight budgets, trusting in the kindness of strangers in unfamiliar lands. Among his confirmed and suspected victims were a young American woman and a Canadian man, murdered in Nepal in 1975, a Dutch couple, and other travelers far from home. The true number of his victims has never been settled, scattered as they were across several countries and several years. Sobhraj targeted exactly the kind of carefree young tourists who would not be missed quickly, in countries where a foreigner's death might go uninvestigated for weeks. He did not work alone. Accomplices helped him drug and control his victims and move between borders. Chief among them were a devoted girlfriend and a male associate who carried out his orders, a small circle bound to him by manipulation and fear. Sobhraj was arrested in India in 1976 and spent about 21 years in prison there, even briefly escaping before he was recaptured. His escape was pure theater. He threw a party for his guards, drugged them, and walked out, only to be caught again not long after, which some believed he had arranged to extend his sentence and avoid extradition. Released in 1997, he returned to France a strange kind of celebrity. By then, his crimes had inspired books and a television series, and he was treated by some less as a murderer than as a curiosity. Then, in a move that baffled almost everyone, he traveled back to Nepal in 2003, where a journalist recognized him in a Kathmandu casino. He was arrested for the 1975 murders he had never answered for. Some speculated he had returned chasing money or notoriety. Whatever the reason, it cost him his freedom for almost 20 years. How does a man who had slipped justice for decades simply walk back into the one country still waiting to charge him? A Nepalese court convicted Sobhraj and sentenced him to life for the murder of the American woman. And he was convicted again years later over the Canadian man's death. For nearly 2 decades, he sat in a Kathmandu prison, still insisting he was innocent and granting interviews that kept his legend alive. Far from fading into obscurity, he cultivated his own dark celebrity, selling his story and reveling in the attention. Then, in December 2022, Nepal's Supreme Court ordered his release on grounds of age and ill health, noting he had already served most of a life term, which under Nepalese law runs 20 years. In his late 70s and reportedly needing heart surgery, he was deported. The court reasoned that given his age and the length of time already served, there was little justification for keeping him locked up any longer. He arrived in Paris days later and has walked free ever since. Sobhraj remains alive and free in France, now in his 80s, still claiming innocence and still the subject of films and documentaries. His story has been retold so often, on screen and in print, that he has become one of the most famous killers of his era. The man who hunted travelers along the road and who escaped and returned to custody more than once, ended his story not in a cell, but at liberty in his home country, an outcome that has angered the families of those he is believed to have killed. For them, his comfortable old age in France stands as a final injustice. The next case moved from the open road to the open sea, and a husband who saw a cruise as the perfect place to commit murder. Lani Cocantes. A woman vanished from a Mediterranean cruise in the night. The way her body floated proved she had been killed before she ever hit the water. In May 2006, Lonnie Cocantes, a California lawyer, took a Mediterranean cruise with his former wife, Mickey Kane-Saki, who was 52. To outsiders, the trip might have looked like two people on civil terms taking a holiday together. The two had divorced, but still lived together while sorting out their finances. Cocantes had moved on to other relationships, even briefly marrying another woman. Yet he and Kanasaki remained financially entangled, their lives still knotted together by money and property. One night during the voyage, Cocantes strangled Kanasaki and pushed her body overboard, then reported her missing the next morning, as though she had simply disappeared from the ship. The couple had boarded the cruise in Spain, and somewhere in the dark waters of the Mediterranean, he carried out a killing he hoped the sea would swallow without a trace. Kanasaki's body was recovered floating in the sea off the coast of Italy, and that single fact became the key to the case. She was found within days, washed near the Italian coast, far sooner than her killer can have expected. A person who drowns usually takes water into the lungs and sinks. Kanasaki's lungs held no water, which meant she had already been dead, strangled, before she entered the sea. It was a detail a layman might never think of, but to a forensic pathologist, it was decisive. Her body floated precisely because she had not drowned at all, a body that should have sunk instead, rising to the surface. The ocean Cocantes had used to hide his crime instead preserved the proof of it. The very method he had chosen to make the death look accidental was the thing that marked it as murder. What he had staged as a tragic accident at sea was, the evidence showed, a deliberate killing. Prosecutors said the motive was money. There was no witness struggle, no other suspect, only a quiet, calculated act for financial gain. Kanasaki's death left Cocantes positioned to benefit from bank accounts, property, and an estate worth around $1 million. He had planned, they argued, to make her vanish in international waters where no one would look too closely. A death at sea, in foreign waters, between countries, was meant to be the kind of case no one would ever solve. Cocantes drew federal attention in 2008 after he tried to move a large sum between bank accounts, and investigators began to pull the case apart. It was a financial move, not the killing itself, that first put him back under the microscope, and from there, the old case was reopened. Years passed before charges came, but he was eventually indicted and arrested at his home in Florida. By then, he had built a new life. But the past finally caught up with him. While in custody, he was accused of trying to arrange the killing of another woman, a former wife, to stop her from testifying against him. The alleged plot, hatched from behind bars, painted a picture of a man who would kill again to protect himself. In 2020, Cocantes was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance that he had killed for financial gain. It had taken 14 years, but a jury finally held him responsible for the death he had tried to bury at sea. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The lawyer who had believed the open sea would give him the perfect cover, a death far from home that would be written off as an accident, had been undone by the basic science of how a body behaves in water. A man trained in the law had gambled that distance, and deep water would protect him, and lost. Cocantes maintains his innocence. He is serving life without parole in a California prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The estate he is said to have killed for did him no good in the end. The next case involved not one killer, but a married couple who turned a holiday weekend at the beach into a double murder. Erica and Benjamin Sifrit. A young married couple met another couple on a night out and invited them back to their penthouse. Only the married couple left alive. Over a holiday weekend in May 2002, Erica and Benjamin Sifrit, a married couple in their 20s, met Joshua Ford and Jeannie Crutchley on a night out in Ocean City, Maryland. Ford was 32 and Crutchley 51. a couple from Virginia enjoying the resort town. The four had met by chance and hit it off. The kind of easy holiday friendship that forms over a few drinks on the way to a nightclub. After partying together, all four went back to the Sifrits' rented penthouse. Ford and Crutchley never made it home. Accusing the pair of stealing from them, the Sifrits killed them both inside the condominium, then disposed of the remains, which were later recovered from a landfill. What exactly sparked it remains contested, but by morning, 2 visitors to Ocean City were dead. The couple were not caught for the murders directly. Days later, they were arrested breaking into a Hooters restaurant in the early hours of the morning. When police searched them, they found the victims' driver's licenses, spent shell casings, and a bullet, all of it in Erica's handbag. The Sifrits had been carrying the evidence of a double murder around with them. It was a staggering carelessness, the kind of mistake that hands investigators a case they might otherwise have struggled to build. Erica confessed, but blamed her husband for the killings, while he denied responsibility. How does a couple kill 2 people and then carry the proof in a purse into a late-night burglary? The Sifrits were tried separately because of the intense publicity around the case. The lurid details had saturated local and national coverage, making a fair joint trial impossible. Benjamin was convicted in connection with one of the deaths and sentenced to 38 years. Erica was convicted of the murders and sentenced to life plus 20 years, the jury holding her directly responsible. She received the harsher sentence by far, the court treating her as the more culpable of the 2 despite her efforts to shift the blame onto her husband. The couple, cast in the press as a kind of modern Bonnie and Clyde, divorced while both were behind bars. The marriage that had bound them together through the crime did not survive their imprisonment. On the surface, the Sifrits had been a young, athletic, recently married couple. He was a former Navy man, and she an athletic young woman, and to neighbors, they had seemed an ordinary pair. Beneath it, prosecutors described 2 people who fed off one another and treated a brutal double killing with chilling detachment. Together, the state argued, they had become capable of something neither might have done alone. Each tried to pin the blame on the other, and to this day their exact roles are disputed, with Benjamin still denying any act of murder. The truth of who did what inside that penthouse may never be fully known, locked behind 2 conflicting accounts that have never been reconciled. Erica remains in a Maryland women's prison. More than 20 years on, she is still behind bars. For Joshua Ford and Jeannie Crutchley, 2 people who had simply gone away for a holiday weekend, there would be no such hearings or second chances. In 2026, a parole panel ordered that she wait until 2033 for her next hearing. At that hearing, she spoke of the empty chairs she had left at 2 families' tables. She told the panel the case had opened her eyes to the damage she had done, words her victims' families received with understandable skepticism. Benjamin is serving his term at another Maryland prison and has sought a reduced sentence under a state law that allows those who were young at the time of their crimes to ask for relief, though he is due for release toward the end of this decade in any case. In his petition, he again insisted he had never committed murder, more than 2 decades after the bodies were found, a denial his trial jury did not accept. The next case turned a dream honeymoon at a luxury island resort into a nightmare. Bradley Dawson. A newlywed couple flew halfway around the world to a remote island resort for their honeymoon. Only one of them survived the trip. What should have been the beginning of a marriage became its violent end. In 2022, Bradley Dawson, a Memphis technology worker, and his new wife, Krista Chen, a 36-year-old pharmacist, traveled to an exclusive resort in Fiji for their honeymoon. Chen was a respected pharmacist and a university graduate. Dawson worked in information technology for a Memphis nonprofit. They had married after a short courtship and chosen a private island resort in Fiji's Yasawa chain for the start of their life together. Days into the trip, after a night of drinking and a bitter argument, Dawson beat Chen to death in the bathroom of their bungalow. The fight turned violent, and it ended with Chen dead and her new husband standing over her. He then fled the scene, paddling away by kayak to a nearby island and leaving his wife's body behind. Rather than raise the alarm or seek help, he took to the water and put distance between himself and what he had done. Resort staff grew worried when the couple failed to appear for meals, and they found Chen's body in the bungalow. At a small, remote resort where guests are closely looked after, their absence was quickly noticed. Her injuries were so severe that she could not be embalmed and had to be cremated, a detail that conveyed, without any need for description, the ferocity of the attack. What had begun as a luxury honeymoon at one of the most exclusive resorts in the South Pacific had ended in a killing far from home. Chen's family, half a world away, would soon receive the news no family ever expects from a honeymoon, that the trip had ended in murder. Dawson was tracked down about a day and a half later in a nearby village. Fijian police, working across the scattered islands of the archipelago, located him roughly 36 hours after the body was found. Tellingly, he had taken his passport and wallet, but had left behind his phone and a tracking watch, which the court would later treat as a sign that he had meant to flee. Why take identification and money, the prosecution asked, unless he intended to keep running? What had the argument been about? Reports said Chen had discovered that Dawson had once brought a former wife to that very same resort, a revelation that turned an ordinary honeymoon quarrel lethal. Whatever the spark, the response was wildly, fatally out of proportion. After a trial in a Fijian high court, Dawson was found guilty of murder in late 2024. The case was heard by a judge rather than a jury, over several days and more than a dozen witnesses, before the verdict came down. At sentencing, the judge condemned not only the killing, but what Dawson had done afterward, calling his conduct appalling and telling him he had inflicted terrible injuries on his wife and then fled, leaving her alone and helpless. He was sentenced to life in prison for a killing committed within days of his wedding. On what should have been a celebration, he would lose his own freedom for decades. Who was he? Dawson had married Chen after a short courtship, and the two had traveled across the world for what should have been the happiest trip of their lives. There was no long history of documented violence on display, only a man who, cornered by his own anger, turned it on the woman he had just married. Instead, a single honeymoon argument turned deadly, and his decision to run rather than seek help for his dying wife sealed both her fate and his own. Dawson is serving a life sentence in a Fijian prison and must serve at least 18 years before he can even be considered for release or pardon. He will spend those years far from home, in a country whose courts showed him no leniency. A marriage that had begun only weeks earlier ended with one of them dead and the other facing the rest of his life behind bars in a foreign country. It stands as one of the starkest honeymoon tragedies on record. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying these cases, take a moment to subscribe, because the stories only get stranger from here. The next case returned to the water, and a family cruise that ended in a husband's unthinkable violence. Caniel Martin and Avi Howell. In July 2008, Ben and Catherine Mullaney, a young couple from South Wales, were on honeymoon at a 5-star resort in Antigua, just 2 weeks after their wedding. Catherine was a doctor and Ben a trainee physiotherapist, and the trip had been a gift from family. They had married only a fortnight earlier and had traveled to one of the Caribbean's most exclusive resorts to celebrate the start of their lives together. In the early hours of one morning, intruders broke into their beachside chalet. The couple were asleep when the men forced their way in. Catherine was shot and died almost instantly. Ben, gravely wounded, was flown all the way back to Wales, where he died about a week later after his life support was withdrawn. Only a small amount of cash, a phone, and a camera had been taken. For so little, 2 young lives had been destroyed, a fact that made the crime all the more senseless to those who followed it. The men responsible were two local Antiguans, Caniel Martin and Avi Howell. Martin, known locally by a nickname, and Howell were young men with a record of violent crime on the island. Less than 2 weeks after the Mullaney's were attacked, the pair killed a local shopkeeper, Juanita Anderson, in a strikingly similar way. Anderson, a woman in her 40s, was shot in much the same manner as Catherine Mullaney, confirming to investigators that one pair of killers was behind both attacks. A honeymoon couple and a local woman, all shot within a single fortnight, had turned an island that lived on its safe reputation into the scene of a manhunt. Tourists wondered whether anywhere on the island was truly safe. Detectives from Scotland Yard traveled to Antigua to help local police, and the evidence against Martin and Howell steadily mounted. There was DNA, there was ballistics work, there was gunshot residue, and there was a bandana carrying Howell's DNA at the shopkeeper's murder scene. Each strand on its own might have been challenged, but together they built a case that was hard to argue against. But the most damning piece of all was Ben Mullaney's stolen phone, found at Martin's home with a recording of Martin's own voice on it. Telephone records placed Martin near the resort around the time of the killings. Cell tower data put him close to the chalet in the small hours of the morning when the Mullaney's were attacked. How had two local men come to target honeymooners asleep in their beachside chalet? After a trial lasting 2 months, with more than 90 witnesses, Martin and Howell were convicted in 2011 of the murders of the Mullaney's and of Juanita Anderson, the verdict coming 3 years to the day after the honeymoon attack. It had taken 3 long years to reach this point, years in which the bereaved families waited for justice. Each man was given 3 consecutive life sentences toward the end of that year to the prospect of dying in prison for what they had done. Who were they? Martin and Howell were young local men who had turned to armed robbery and killing, preying on tourists and on their own community alike. The murders shook Antigua, whose economy depended on its image as a safe paradise, and the case drew intense attention in Britain, where the Mullaney's had been a popular, newly married couple whose deaths felt almost unbearably cruel. Their families campaigned for answers and traveled to Antigua to see the trial through. The 2 men met very different fates. Avi Howell escaped from prison in Antigua in 2014, reportedly scaling a high wall with another inmate, and was shot dead by police during the recapture. His bid for freedom lasted only as long as it took the authorities to find him. Caniel Martin remains alive and imprisoned at the island's main prison, serving his 3 consecutive life sentences. He has lodged no successful challenge to his conviction in the years since. While inside, he completed a university prison education program and graduated at the top of his class, a development that drew public criticism given the gravity of his crimes. To some, it showed the value of rehabilitation. To the families of his victims, it was an insult. No successful appeal or release has followed. The next case moved from a Caribbean beach to an Alaskan cruise, and a husband who killed in front of his own family. Kenneth Manzanares. In July 2017, Kenneth Manzanares and his wife, Christy, were on a family cruise to Alaska aboard a large cruise ship, traveling with their children and other relatives. 3 generations of the family had come together for the voyage, including the couple's young daughters and Christy's father and brothers. Christy, 39, was a realtor and interior designer. The couple had been high school sweethearts and were married for nearly 2 decades. By every outward sign, theirs was a long, stable marriage, and the family holiday was meant to be a happy one. In their cabin, an argument escalated after Christy told her husband she wanted a divorce and intended to leave the ship. What was said between them in private will never be fully known, but her decision to end the marriage was the trigger. Manzanares responded by beating her to death. The attack was ferocious, and it was over before anyone could reach her in time. The violence was not hidden away in some quiet corner of the ship. The couple's children heard screaming, and Christie's brother found Manzanares with her body near the cabin balcony. He had apparently been trying to move her toward the balcony when the family burst in and intervened, dragging her back from the edge. The attack had been so savage that the family who loved her were left shattered, having heard and seen far more than anyone ever should. Manzanares reportedly offered a chilling explanation to a relative, saying she would not stop laughing at him. It was a remark that seemed to capture how little it had taken for him to turn deadly. What had begun as a holiday to share the beauty of Alaska had become the scene of an unthinkable killing carried out among his own family. The cruise, sold as a celebration of the state's wild coastline, would forever be remembered for the violence aboard it. Because the ship was in United States waters when Christie died, the FBI took over the investigation. Although the cruise had set off toward Alaska, the vessel remained within American jurisdiction, which meant federal agents, not a foreign police force, would handle the case. Manzanares was charged with murder and in 2020 pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, formally accepting responsibility for his wife's death. The guilty plea spared the family the ordeal of a full trial, though it could not spare them the memory of that night. There was little to contest. The killing had happened with relatives close at hand, and the evidence aboard the ship was overwhelming. In 2021, a federal judge sentenced Manzanares to 30 years in prison, an unusually long term that the court imposed as a deliberate step above the normal range, reflecting the brutality of the crime, followed by years of supervised release. The judge made clear the savagery of the attack justified going beyond what the guidelines would normally suggest. For the daughters who had lost their mother, no sentence could undo what they had witnessed that day at sea. Who was he? Manzanares and Christie had built a life together since their teenage years, raising a family in Utah, and to outsiders they had seemed settled and successful. They had been together since they were teenagers, the kind of couple neighbors assumed would grow old together. Whatever pressures lay beneath that surface, the instant Christie said she wanted to leave, her husband answered with lethal violence in a place surrounded by the people they both loved most. Kenneth Manzanares is now dead. About a month after his sentencing, he was found unresponsive in his cell at a correctional center in Juneau, Alaska, and pronounced dead while he was still awaiting transfer to federal prison. His death came almost as abruptly as the crime, cutting short a 30-year sentence after only weeks. Foul play was not suspected. The case closed not with decades served, but with the killer's own death, only weeks after a court had finally held him to account. For Christie's daughters, left without their mother, the ending offered finality but no comfort, and no answers about why their father had done it. The next case was another cruise, another balcony, and another woman who never made it home. Eric Dwayne Newman. A couple boarded a cruise to the Bahamas to celebrate. Hours after the ship set sail, only one of them was still alive. In January 2018, Eric Dwayne Newman and his longtime girlfriend, Tamara Tucker, boarded a Carnival cruise from Florida bound for the Bahamas. Newman was 55 and Tucker 50, and the trip was meant to be a getaway for the two of them. The couple had set out from Florida on a short, round-trip cruise, the sort of quick, affordable holiday thousands of people take each year. Before the first night was over, the couple argued in their cabin high up on the ship. Whatever the dispute was about, it escalated quickly in the close quarters of the cabin. In the early hours of the morning, Newman strangled Tucker and pushed her over the cabin balcony railing. What began as a quarrel ended with a deadly assault and a body sent over the side. She fell to a lower deck and died of her injuries. It was a fall of 2 decks, and she did not survive it. The ship was on the high seas, roughly 30 nautical miles off the Florida coast, which placed the case squarely under United States federal jurisdiction. Crimes committed aboard a ship in such waters fall to the United States courts. And so a cabin killing miles from land became a federal case. The FBI's Jacksonville field office took on the investigation. Federal agents took up the case once the ship returned to port, treating the cabin as a crime scene and the passengers as witnesses. The circumstances left little doubt about what had happened. Newman had attacked Tucker with his own hands and then sent her over the railing to the deck below. In the confined world of a cruise ship, where movements and timings are far easier to reconstruct than a killer might assume, cabins, corridors, and decks are watched, logged, and remembered by other passengers, leaving little room for a false story to take hold. There was nowhere to run and no convincing way to recast a death like this as an accident. In 2019, Newman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting that he had killed Tamara Tucker with malice aforethought. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial and the risk of a harsher first-degree verdict. A federal judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, ordered years of supervised release to follow, and directed him to pay restitution to Tucker's family. The restitution was a modest sum meant to cover the family's costs, a small acknowledgement against an irreplaceable loss. The relatively contained sentence, compared with some others on this list, reflected the second-degree plea rather than any doubt about what he had done. Second-degree murder carries a lighter penalty than a premeditated killing, and the plea agreement set the term accordingly. Who was he? Newman and Tucker had been together for a long time, and what should have been a celebratory escape turned, within hours of leaving port, into a fatal assault in a small cabin far above the sea. There was no clear public account of a long history of violence between them, only the sudden, lethal events of that first night. The speed of it was striking. The couple had barely cleared the harbor before the relationship ended in Tucker's death over a balcony rail. There had been no slow unraveling on this trip, only a single violent night within hours of departure that cost a woman her life. Newman's case is a clear example of a pattern that runs through these stories. A cruise is marketed as carefree escape, yet out on the open water, a sudden surge of rage has nowhere to dissipate, and help can be decks and hours away. For Tamara Tucker, a trip meant to be shared became the place she lost her life. She had boarded the ship expecting a celebration and never returned to shore alive. Newman is serving his 12-year federal sentence in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons. Given the timing of his plea and sentencing, he is likely still incarcerated, with his release expected to arrive within the next several years rather than decades away. Unlike the killers in some of these cases, he will one day walk free. The next case raised a darker question still. Was a honeymoon drowning a tragic accident or a calculated murder? Gabe Watson. A honeymoon dive on the Great Barrier Reef left a new bride dead at the bottom of the sea. Her husband's account never quite added up, yet a court would ultimately clear him of murder. In October 2003, Gabe Watson and his wife, Tina, were scuba diving on their honeymoon at a famous shipwreck off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The couple had married in Alabama and traveled to Australia to dive the Great Barrier Reef, one of the world's most celebrated diving destinations. Tina, 26, drowned during the dive. A young woman who had been married only days earlier died on what should have been a celebration. Watson, an experienced rescue diver with dozens of dives logged, said she had panicked underwater, knocked off his mask and regulator, and sunk before he could reach her. Tina, by contrast, was a relative novice with only a handful of dives behind her, and she had a known heart condition. The dive site, a deep wreck off Townsville, was a challenging one, especially for someone so inexperienced. Australian prosecutors did not accept Watson's version of events. They alleged that he had deliberately turned off his wife's air supply, allowed her to die, and then turned it back on. And they pointed to a possible motive tied to life insurance. It was a stark accusation that a husband had killed his bride on their honeymoon for money, and it would dominate the case in both countries. To them, an experienced rescue diver's story of being helpless, beside a struggling beginner simply did not fit. Could a trained diver really have been unable to save a novice right next to him? That question hung over the case on 2 continents, and ultimately it was one the evidence could not resolve to a criminal standard. Watson pleaded guilty to manslaughter in Australia in 2008 on the basis of criminal negligence rather than intent, and served 18 months. By his own admission, he had failed to do what a trained rescue diver should have done to save her, though he denied any intent to kill. After his release, he was held for a time in immigration custody. Australia, which has no death penalty, refused to deport him until it was certain he would not be executed if returned to the United States, where his home state of Alabama wanted to try him for murder. American prosecutors believed the manslaughter outcome had been far too lenient. Alabama duly charged Watson with murder, alleging he had planned the killing before the couple ever left home, but the case fell apart in court. In 2012, the judge granted a directed acquittal after the prosecution had presented its case, finding the state's evidence sorely lacking and no financial motive proven. A key Australian diving expert had also retracted much of his original testimony. Without that expert evidence, a central plank of the prosecution's theory had collapsed. The case was dismissed, with no possibility of appeal. Under the law, a directed acquittal of this kind ends the matter for good, and Watson could never be retried for the murder in Alabama. Who was he? Watson was a certified rescue diver, and that very expertise was part of why his wife's death drew suspicion in the first place. An accomplished diver losing a beginner at his side struck many as hard to believe, fairly or not. But suspicion is not proof. And the 2 legal systems that examined the case reached very different places. He had admitted criminal negligence in Australia and served his time there. Yet in Alabama, he was cleared of murder outright when the evidence did not hold up. The same death had produced a guilty plea on one continent and a full acquittal on another. Watson remains a free man today. He completed his Australian manslaughter sentence, was acquitted in Alabama, and has since remarried and lived without further charges. His case stands apart on this list. A death that 2 justice systems treated in starkly different ways, ending not in a murder conviction, but in an acquittal that can never be challenged. Tina's family in the United States were left without the murder verdict they had long sought. The final case took a birthday celebration in Costa Rica and turned it into a murder that outraged 2 countries. Bismarck Espinosa Martinez. A woman flew to Costa Rica to celebrate her birthday. She was killed the night before she was due to fly home. In November 2018, Carla Stefaniak, a 36-year-old insurance agent, traveled to Costa Rica to celebrate her birthday with a relative. She had come with a sister-in-law to mark her 36th birthday, renting a villa in a suburb of the Costa Rican capital through a holiday letting site. After her companion flew home, Stefaniak stayed on for 1 extra night, and it was that single extra night, alone at the rental, that proved fatal. Around the time she went to ask the guard for water, she was attacked and killed. Her body was found days later, partially buried in woods a short distance from the villa where she had been staying. It took days of searching before she was found in the surrounding woodland, not far from where she had last been seen. The man responsible was Bismarck Espinosa Martinez, a security guard at the property who lived in the unit right next to hers. A Nicaraguan national working at the rental, he had been only steps away from her room the whole time she believed she was safe. Investigators concluded that the crime was sexually motivated and came to believe that Stefaniak had rejected his advances. The man entrusted with guarding the guests had, prosecutors said, turned on one of them when she refused him. When she failed to appear for her flight home, her family raised the alarm, and a search began that ended with the grim discovery of her remains in the surrounding woodland. The evidence pointed squarely at Martinez. Blood was found in Stefaniak's room despite an effort to clean it away with bleach and other chemicals. He had tried to scrub the scene, but traces remained that investigators were able to recover. His account of that night did not match the surveillance footage or the statements of witnesses. and a housekeeper testified that Martinez's own mother had said he had confessed to her. Cameras around the property told a different story from the one he gave police, and his own family appeared to know the truth. He was arrested within days of the body being found, in custody and charged. How had a guard whose job was to keep guests safe become the man who killed one of them? Martinez was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years in a Costa Rican prison. He was acquitted of a robbery charge for lack of evidence and found not guilty of the more serious charge of first-degree murder. The court convicted him of the lesser homicide offense, rather than the premeditated charge prosecutors had sought. Prosecutors had asked for 18 years, while Stefaniak's family had wanted far longer, and her father openly condemned the Costa Rican justice system as too lenient and indifferent. He called the process negligent and complacent, words that captured the family's fury at a sentence they saw as a fraction of what the crime deserved. Who was she? Stefaniak was a Venezuelan-American woman from the Miami area who had simply wanted to mark her birthday abroad, the kind of trip taken by countless travelers every year. She had family in Florida who waited anxiously for word and then received the worst possible news. Her death and the relatively short sentence her killer received became a source of lasting anger for her family, who felt the outcome did not come close to matching the crime. What had been a happy milestone trip had ended in horror, and the legal aftermath only compounded their grief. The case drew wide attention in the United States as a sobering warning about the risks travelers can face, even at rentals that seem perfectly safe. It became a cautionary tale repeated across American news coverage, particularly for women traveling abroad and staying in short-term rentals. Martinez is serving his 16-year sentence, and his appeals have been rejected, the courts upholding both his conviction and his sentence on review. Under Costa Rican law, good behavior can reduce a sentence substantially, which means he could potentially be released years before the full term is served, possibly before the end of the decade. A killer convicted of taking a young woman's life could, in practice, be free again within a few years. For Carla Stefaniak's family, that prospect has only deepened a sense of injustice that began the night she went to ask a guard for water and never came back. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video